So, thanks everybody for tuning in and watching this. I'm Cav, and joining me is. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Richard Morris. I'm a racing driver. I drive for CW Performance Praga in the Brit Car Endurance Championship, and I'm also co-founder of Racing Pride.
So, would you be able to explain what Racing Pride does as an organisation? Because from what I gather, it was founded 2 years ago, so 2019.
Yeah, so Racing Pride launched in 2019. It's a project that myself and some others have been working on for a few months before that, but appeared in Pride Month, June 2019. Racing Pride, its mission is to promote LGBTQ plus inclusion through motorsport. We have a network of different ambassadors, so some drivers. There's myself, but there's also Charlie Martin, also racing at Praga. There's Sarah Moore and Abby Eaton, who are W Series drivers, and you probably know Abby as the test driver on the Grand Tour. Then there's a range of other ambassadors in different roles. We have some engineers, mechanics, marshals, volunteers, officials, people in all sorts of different areas of motorsport, including some media ambassadors. And of course, we have an esports ambassador, sim driver, Cami Sturch, who races for Team Fordzilla, Ford's team.
And outside of like Racing Pride, have you would talk about your role in Praga, but have you had any other kind of experiences or expertise in different roles in motorsport?
Yeah, so my kind of involvement in motorsport has been as a driver, but I've been in it a long time. So I started out as a kid in karting, like most drivers get into it. And I worked my way through some direct drive karting for the nerds out there, TKM. Then I was in gearbox karting, which is just insane. They're karts that go 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds, top speeds about 115 miles an hour, and you race them with no bodywork, no seatbelts, nothing, just a massive motorbike engine strapped to a chassis. And I loved that. But I decided I wanted to move on to car racing. So I went Formula Ford single seaters, a couple of years in that. That went very well. In my first year, I had 9 races. I won 4 of them, and I qualified on pole for 8 of them. So probably should have won more than I did, but nevertheless was quite quick as the headline. And then the second year, I came runner-up, vice champion, if you will, in the British National Championship, and that opened up my chances to race in sports prototype racing. And I became works driver for a small sports prototype company called Spire Sports Cars, and raced one of their cars for 2019 and 2020. Again, seemed to go pretty well. I got on the podium 15 out of 22 races, so a lot of silverware picked up. Last year was very disrupted, obviously, but 4 meetings, 3 wins, and a lap record. So we went pretty well. And then that set up my chance to race Praga now. So yeah, I've been in motorsport a long time, basically as a driver. Don't ask me to actually design anything. That's not really my thing.
And in terms of the work you do with Racing Pride, like for a lot of people, I saw on your Twitter you were talking about people saying that what you do is activism. But how does that? How because it's so much a part of your identity and who you are. I can say from my own personal experience, I don't consider any of this stuff activism on my own end. How do you engage with people who think that what you're doing is political activism for a cause when it's just you asking for people to accept people who are part of the LGBTQ plus community?
Yeah, so I think there's a few sort of connected things there. I mean, what I'm doing with Racing Pride really is trying to change the situation for people coming into the sport from kind of how I experienced it. And as a gay man who's also a racing driver, really I hadn't had any role models or anything to suggest that I would be accepted in the sport. You know, there's loads and loads of racing drivers, but you don't see successful gay racing drivers that you can easily look up to, or you certainly didn't when I was coming into the sport. And it meant it was really difficult to talk about my life genuinely, openly in the sport, and to have the same kind of relationship with mechanics, with people around me that people easily have, who perhaps, you know, come from more well-represented communities within sport. So, nobody, well, for the vast majority of the time, people weren't trying to discriminate against me. I just didn't feel it was that easy for me to be included. And I didn't see there was a community of people like me in the sport either. And all we're trying to do with Racing Pride is to start those conversations, to make people feel that there is a community out there for them, that there are role models, that are people being successful in lots of forms of motorsport. And also to provide a little bit of education too, of how people can be good allies. So we have our ally pack, which is on the website, and we also run workshops and educational events with our partners, including our most recent partner, Aston Martin Formula One team. We've been working hard with them, making sure they are inclusive from a policy perspective in their day-to-day practices. But yeah, whether you can call any of that kind of activism, I guess I find a little bit difficult because, as you say, it is just personally me being myself, being open as a gay racing driver now as opposed to being closeted. And secondly, just trying to create that sense of community and that opportunity for allies to be part of that community too. I don't see that as being political. And I think people often say, oh, why are we doing this motorsport? Sport isn't about politics, but sport is about people. And what we're doing isn't about politics either. What we're doing is about people and including people. And that's all it is. And I think to have the strongest sport you can have, you need to include as many people as possible. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from with it.
Yeah, I've got to say, I agree about the motorsports and politics thing. I mean, for me, I just think about the fact that motorsports and all sports are inherently political. We talk about the politics of F1 all the time. It just so happens that people are usually thinking about more like Spygate or something like that, rather than further kind of diversity and representation. But you've talked about your work with Aston Martin, and you've been working with many other like partners, either directly as yourself as an ambassador or through Racing Pride as an organisation. And Aston Martin was the big one that was announced right at the start of Pride. That was announced on the 1st of June, and the branding, I believe, is going to be on the car from the French Grand Prix?
Exactly, yeah.
So is there any other kind of plans you're looking at doing? Not just for Pride Month, because of course it's not just a month; it is a year-round thing. It's something that we have to think about all the time. Have you got any other plans that you can talk about here, working forward?
Yeah, so we do have a number of partners, and they're at different levels in the sport, which is something that we're really proud of. So we have some very grassroots partnerships. We have particularly British University's Tying Championship Formula Student, aimed at students and people trying to get into the sport. We've done various bits highlighting LGBTQ plus karters. And we work with a team called Red Seal Racing, which is really entry-level tin top club racing. And then we have the three big organising clubs in British motorsport: BARC, 750 Motor Club, BRSCC. And we enjoy engaging with all of them. We have plans with each of them as well going forward. And of course, right up to Aston Martin. So we do try to go from what we call grassroots to Grand Prix, and value all of our partnerships all the way up. I'm also working with Motorsport UK as the chair of their LGBTQ plus subcommittee and sitting on their main EDI committee, which I think is really exciting. So that's going to look at ways that Motorsport UK as an organisation can promote inclusion, but also spread education and awareness through key actors in the sport. So your clerks, your officials, your venues, your organisers, and so on. So there's a lot of work to be done there, and that's integrated with their safeguarding and everything. In terms of the other partners that we work with, so we're constantly trying to do visibility initiatives with them. We share content on social media and so on. We have things like BRSCC and 750 before them, giving out lots of Racing Pride stickers at meetings for drivers to put on their cars to show that they want to support this cause. We're going back to doing some live events. Obviously during COVID that was difficult, but you'll find us at big shows. We spoke at Motorsport International. We're going to be attending various events later this year. We're able to come and find us. And we're just going to keep essentially doing what we're doing, sharing our stories as ambassadors and sharing the stories of other members of the LGBTQ plus community throughout motorsport, as I say, from grassroots to Grand Prix, working with our different partners.
And I think that brings us on to talk about like things going on at the moment, going on today. What do you see, like either through yourself or through your network of ambassadors, as the kind of biggest barriers for members of the LGBTQ plus community today, in particular in regards to motorsport? So, be that through, like you said, you've got students, you've got sim racers, you've got journalists and drivers, and also people who are in and around motorsport as well. What would you say comes across as some of the biggest barriers?
Yeah, I think motorsport has a little bit of a cultural problem when it comes to this form of diversity and inclusion. So a lot of the traditional imagery of motorsport is macho hypermasculinity that very much appeals to a particular demographic. And that I think creates an expectation of what motorsport's going to be like that perhaps puts some people off and makes it difficult for some people to enter into the sport in the first place because they don't think the sport will be a receptive place for them. I think to a lesser extent, but still true, that carries across a little bit into sim racing because of its association with the sport. And as I say, in some cases that means that people just don't come into the sport. In other cases, it means that they hide who they are within the sport. So for a long time, I was closeted within the sport. I wouldn't talk about being gay. I wouldn't therefore have that same connection with people. I wouldn't be able to join in the easy conversations in the garage about what did you do last weekend? Because what I did was go out with my boyfriend. And I wouldn't be able to bring my boyfriend to the awards presentations in the way people would have their girlfriends there. And just those things that made everything a little bit harder. And what we need to do really is to shift that culture because actually, I think there are a lot of people within the sport who want to be welcoming and inclusive. I believe that is the vast majority of people in the sport. And what we need is, hopefully through things like Racing Pride, to show that LGBTQ plus people can be welcome and accepted, can have a great time and great careers in this sport, or just be welcome as fans and set up a way for allies to show that they want to be part of that process. So every time someone shares a Racing Pride tweet or, follows a social media account or says to their friend in the paddock, like, hey, I saw this Racing Pride thing, I think that's really great, they're helping to create a culture that actually says, no, look, we want to be inclusive, this is who we are now. And that'll encourage more and more LGBTQ plus people, one, into the sport, and two, to be themselves within it.
And where you talk about things like representation and in particular sporting series, and you've been talking about Grand Prix a few times, the series that is F1 is often seen as one where there's very little representation. I mean, there are articles that say Mike Butler was the only one who was openly gay who competed in the history of the sport. There are other records that talk about Lella Lombardi as well. But there are some people who are within F1 or have been within F1 who have been openly out. Matt Bishop is a good example of that, who worked with McLaren for a number of years. Well, what would you say is the best way to push for more of this kind of representation in somewhere like Formula One?
Yeah, so Formula One has had relatively little LGBTQ plus representation, certainly on the driving side. There are quite a lot of LGBTQ plus people working in Formula One within the teams, many of whom fans don't necessarily know about. And I think that is actually something that can change, and that Racing Pride is sort of starting to change by featuring people like Matt Bishop, but also Christina Emanuelidis, who is a CFD aerodynamics engineer at Alfa Romeo, and showing these people can have careers in Formula One. But I think both on that side and on the driving side, you're going to struggle to have visible out LGBTQ plus people until you create an environment in which they feel comfortable to come out. It's not that there haven't been those people, it's that they haven't felt able to be themselves in the sport. And so I think what needs to happen is a cultural shift whereby people know that they can be out in the sport, that they will be respected by their colleagues in the sport and by fans, that they will be safe, and then they will come out from that environment and you'll have more role models. But I think Racing Pride's kind of position is that it's not worth us all just sitting around waiting, hoping that an F1 driver will come out and that will fix everything. Because that's not the way anything works. I mean, there is Lewis Hamilton, obviously fantastic black driver, but it doesn't mean there's no racism in motorsport. So what we think is a better approach is to work on that broader culture and to highlight the LGBTQ plus people that there are in different roles in the sport, at different levels in the sport, still doing awesome things. Right, those people, and as I say, therefore try to shift where the sport is positioned over time, and that will naturally lead to more LGBTQ plus people feeling comfortable to be themselves, and that will become reflected at the highest levels.
And from there on, like, not just Formula One, but for wider motorsports, over your time, in motorsport, what do you think is the kind of the biggest change, or what changes have you noticed that have shown a wider kind of acceptance or a more progressive acceptance of members of the community in motorsport?
Yeah, I mean, motorsport in some ways only changes very slowly, and a lot of that is because of the vested interests that there are in motorsport, the large amounts of money that there are, the fact that the same sort of groups of people tend to control a lot of things. But there has been change, and things are starting to shift. So it actually really struck me, the uptake when we started doing Racing Pride amongst my competitors. So we were giving out Racing Pride stickers at the first race meeting I did after we announced, and almost every single one of my competitors took a Racing Pride sticker to put on their cars. And for me, that was such a strong show of solidarity, because they were saying, we might be rivals, but I still believe in this cause. And that, created visible inclusion that I'd never seen before at a racetrack. But also, things are starting to move in the right direction. Whatever people might think of the We Race as One initiative and whether or not it's perfect, it is motorsport starting to talk about diversity and inclusion at that level. And equally, obviously, us doing this partnership with Aston Martin Formula One team, speaking with others involved in the sport. I've just come to this interview today from speaking to staff of Formula One headquarters about how they can be good allies to LGBTQ plus people around them. These conversations are starting to happen, and I think that's inevitably going to lead to progress. It's not going to change everything overnight, but I think we are headed in the right direction. And that's been the biggest shift that I've seen in my time in motorsport, is these things being something that is never talked about. People might be passively tolerant of, and they might be passive allies, but they'd never have the conversation. So now, only in the last couple of years, we've started to have those conversations, and I think that's a massive step.
And you've been talking about like changes within the likes of F1. I mean, for example, on the program this year, W Series, where you've talked about some of the drivers, such as Abby Eaton. You've got women who are going to be competing on the scene, and some of them are out and members of the LGBTQ plus community. Do you think that there's, I mean, we're both speaking as men here, but do you think that there's a way for intersectionality, such as the increased prevalence of women in motorsport, to be able to be a gateway to increased LGBTQ plus acceptance in motorsport?
Yeah, definitely. So we're delighted to have a couple of our ambassadors in W Series with Abby Eaton and Sarah Moore. And I'm sure Abby won't mind me saying that her girlfriend, Jessica Hawkins, is also on the W Series grid and is an ambassador for Aston Martin.
Yeah.
And so we're also glad to have that association and connection. There is definitely a crossover in that environments which are inclusive and accepting are inclusive and accepting of everyone. Progress in one area does have a knock-on effect to progress in other areas. And also there's a lot of research to suggest that women's sport is ahead of men's sport in being inclusive of the LGBTQ plus community. And I think you can even see that anecdotally when you look at the number of professional women's footballers who are out at the highest level compared to the complete absence of any in the men's game. And so I think having greater female participation in motorsport, bringing that culture of greater acceptance that there is in women's sport, will have a positive effect on LGBTQ plus inclusion. And it's just a great thing in its own right, to motorsport becoming more welcoming, more inclusive, and essentially growing by embracing new communities.
That is That's a brilliant point to be able to go on to my final question, which is, what are your hopes for the future, both like for yourself personally and for Racing Pride? Like, if we're talking like the next 5-10 years, where do you see like this kind of work going towards?
Well, in terms of my personal hopes, I want to keep winning races and championships. That is what I'm in this for. I'm in sports prototype endurance racing now. I would obviously, the dream is to race at Le Mans and at the WEC and the highest levels of sports prototype racing. Although I'm one of these people who just loves driving racing cars, and if I can keep having the chance to do that, then I'll be very happy, So, yeah, that's my personal perspective. But Racing Pride, I just want to see, firstly, obviously, that movement grow, and I want to see more series getting involved. I want to see us reach further across the sport, so more interaction with rallying, with motorbikes, with different disciplines that perhaps haven't quite got to being partners with Racing Pride yet. And I'd like us to grow internationally as well. We're aware that we have lots of followers in different territories, and we'd like to find ways of working with partners in those territories to do something meaningful, directly meaningful to those followers. And we, I think, want to get to a situation where there is no longer this fear of talking about LGBTQ plus inclusion in the sport. I think that's the biggest difference that Racing Pride's growth can make. That just as I think, started to get to the point with End Racism, whereby top level teams across series and across countries are prepared to say we stand against racism and talk about it and talk about what they're doing to take steps to end racism within their organization. That's where I want us to get with LGBTQ plus inclusion, that it's something that people can talk openly about. They can talk frankly about the current situation, and they can talk about what measurable steps they're going to take to improve the current situation.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time. And if people want to follow you, it's what would the best handles be? I think Racing Pride is Racing Pride HQ on Twitter, and then for yourself.
Yep. So Racing Pride is always Racing Pride HQ. On Twitter, I'm at Richard M Racing, and on Instagram, I'm at Richard Morris Racing.
Excellent, and thank you so much for joining me. All the best now, not only with like the weekend ahead with Praga and the rest of the season, but also in the future with Racing Pride.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the chance to chat to you.